Like Joyce and Orton, Manet's contemporary critics use similar terms like riddle or rebus to describe his work, and Michael Fried glosses these comments as follows. From an early date, starting with the response to the Déjeuner sur l'herbe in the Salon des Refusés, the personages in Manet's paintings were found to be inexplicably blank, opaque, non-communicating, without psychological interiority of any kind. And it is as though something, an obduracy or opacity or blankness or indifference, rebuffs or at least strongly resists all attempts at hermeneutic penetration. In another helpful analysis, T.J. Clark discusses the notorious example of Olympia, seen here, which created a huge scandal when it was exhibited in the 1865 Paris Salon. Clark painstakingly reads through the criticism, looking at a range of responses, including those in caricature, and discovers that of 70-something mentions of this painting in the Salon literature of that year, only 2 identified Manet's source, the Venus of Urbino by Titian. And so Clark thinks this is kind of interesting, and he argues that in some important sense, what this must mean is that Manet's contemporaries could not see Olympia as a nude. It organized no space, no psychic space for the viewer, as that genre was supposed to do. It was too particular, it was unfinished, ugly, and it was somehow, importantly, again, beyond words. Thus, one critic wondered if the Dictionary of French Aesthetics contains expressions to characterize her. So if Wall's work is a puzzle that points to Manet's work, which is an enigma, then nothing is explained by referring to the sources, which remain stubbornly reticent, except that the mysterious, the enigmatic, the obscure, and the illegible are somehow in play. But this itself, I think, is an important clue. According to Clark, Manet gave sexuality, class, and exchange a particular form. The violent reaction against it was partly, in fact, and this is reasonable, a genuine inability to recognize the semiotic reorganization of pictorial tradition, mixed with a fear that money was somehow remaking the world completely. Sex, class, and space were all jumbled up. And painting alone was not a victim of submitting to this process. Paris, the city itself, along with patterns of consumption and leisure, were being taken apart and reassembled according to the urgent new needs of capital. Mapping Clark's analysis of Manet onto Wall, it would be tempting to claim that Wall's work somehow indexes or reflects or otherwise evidences a new reification, according to the cultural logic of late capitalism. Whereas Manet's epoch was marked by industrial capitalism, then this kind of analysis would go, Jeff Wall saw an explosion of finance capitalism, including features like electronic trading, which sadly we're all too familiar with now, new financial products, CDOs, and so on, the integration of commercial and investment banks, often with disastrous results. Since 1980, Wall Street has become more profitable than any other industry in the United States, although it doesn't design, build, or sell a single tangible thing. At the same time, these new economic structures affect every aspect of our daily lives, which are spent consuming commodities, and our consumption is in turn repackaged and sold as a commodity, making work and leisure, consumption and production not 2 moments any longer in a system of capital reproduction, but newly and irreducibly identical. Throughout this process, art has become increasingly aware of its implication in political economy, as opportunities, sadly, for it to extract itself have diminished. But this connection between art and capitalism remains abstract, unless we can posit a mediating link, which in Wall's case is art history itself. During the 1970s, attempts were being made to revise base superstructure in order to make use of social material for cultural analysis without resorting to naive models of reflection, causality, or analogy. And in fact, Clark, who I talked about, was foremost among social historians of art to develop new concrete historical methods. For example, the one that I mentioned, namely reading the changing urban geography of Paris as a map of reification. With the help of post-structuralism, this new Marxist thinking posited that the economy itself was a kind of representation. But then conversely, this meant that culture, rather than being merely epiphenomenal superstructure, had itself a new kind of autonomy. Wall was studying art history at the Courtauld during this period, and he read the same Marxist critical theory as Clark did. Clark actually took his PhD the year that Wall left without actually getting his PhD to return to Canada. So if Wall hoped then to represent everyday life, he couldn't just go out and photograph it directly, as if class or gender or the economy were somehow positive things available, just waiting to be captured on film. Any representation of these things would have to acknowledge their status as representations, which would mean acknowledging the inadequacy of any representation whatsoever to do the work it used to. In other words, this would mean foregrounding the constructedness of representation, which Wall does in a number of ways, such as making large-scale Tableau-like photographs and rehearsing with his models over and over again so that their gestures become completely automatic and register as unnatural, unfamiliar, or illegible. On the other hand, although objective reality was no longer available, an established artistic tradition was, namely the one epitomized by Manet. As Clark says, the courting of failure and indescribability is one main feature of what that culture was. So for Wall, this whole idea of the painting of modern life still had potential. Wall's work is neither a simple return to the past nor a simple representation of present reality. Indeed, his constructed tableau are at pains to show how neither of those choices is any longer plausible. On one hand, painting is available as a tradition, but it is outmoded, and the entire history of modernism, and especially the fact of modernism's becoming historical to us now, or at least in 1978, means that Wall cannot simply be a painter if he wants to represent contemporary life. On the other hand, he can't simply be a photographer either, for the reasons that I've just explained. So Boris Groys is wrong. Neither painting nor photography have the capacity to make statements about the world, at least not in any straightforward sense. It is only by imitating the painting of the past that Wall can convincingly photograph the present, thereby enacting a double mediation. The mediation is simultaneously temporal and material, past and present, painting and photography. In order to keep all of these elements in play, Wall must imitate Manet without simply copying him. If the imitation is too close, it becomes a mere copy and appears as repetition, which is still taboo in contemporary art. Wall avoids this by imitating the effect achieved when elements that might constitute a legible figure are at hand but lack motivation, not those specific elements themselves. The imitation of illegibility as such, rather than this or that motif or gesture in Manet, means that Wall can keep a distance between his moment and Manet's, acknowledging the historical distance that separates them while making use of that historical distance precisely in the way that I described. The particular charge of Wall's tableau results from a delicate tension between unity and fragmentation, between the even glass-like surface of the print and the odd disposition of the figures. Our expectation that something is about to be said in these works makes the actual silence all that more resounding. To the degree to which Wall's work follows Manet's, it reveals an inverted discursive situation. Illegibility, I think, is sensed, but it is no longer tolerated by the critical machine. Whereas Manet's public could not see his explicit attempts to align himself with the tradition of tableau painting, Wall's critics today can see only this noble lineage. But as I have tried to show, Wall is misread by his critics when he is most straightforwardly read. A better approach would be to begin by moving sideways, not reading Wall's iconography as signs that mean Manet, but referring their mutual illegibility to the problem of representing modern life. Thank you.